The jungle was eerily silent. Adam could feel the tension in the air as he crouched behind a thick bush, his breathing shallow. His eyes were fixed on the massive lioness lying on her side, panting heavily. She was in distress. Her golden fur was matted with sweat, her sides heaving as she struggled to bring new life into the world. He knew the risks, knew that one wrong move could mean his death. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. It had started hours ago when Adam, a seasoned wildlife conservationist, noticed the lioness behaving strangely. She had separated from her pride, her movements slow and pained. At first he assumed she was injured, but as he watched her settle under the shade of an ancient baobab tree, he realized the truth. She was in labor, and something was wrong. Sweat trickled down Adam's brow as he adjusted his position, careful not to startle her. He had spent years observing lions, understanding their behaviors, but never had he been this close during such a vulnerable moment. He knew intervening was a gamble, but if he didn't act, she and her cubs might not survive. Steeling his nerves, Adam inched forward. The lioness let out a deep growl, her golden eyes flickering with pain and warning. His heart pounded. Any sudden movement could trigger an attack. He raised his hands slowly, whispering softly. He wasn't sure if she could understand, but his voice was steady, soothing. Then he saw it, the reason for her agony. The first cub was stuck. It was still partially inside her, its tiny form unmoving. Time was running out. Adam knew he had to act fast. Slowly, he pulled a medical kit from his pack, his fingers trembling. He had delivered animal births before, but never one so dangerous. The lioness growled again, but this time there was something different in her eyes, a desperate plea for help. Taking a deep breath, he edged closer, his hands shaking as he reached out. His fingers brushed against the damp fur of the cub. It was warm but lifeless. He had no choice. He gripped the tiny body gently, giving it a careful pull. The lioness roared, her claws digging into the earth. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he held firm, coaxing the cub free. And then it happened. The cub slipped into his hands, limp and motionless. Adam's heart sank. It wasn't breathing. Panic surged through him. He had risked everything for this moment, and now it was slipping away. He acted on pure instinct, rubbing the tiny body vigorously, willing it to take a breath. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then a small gasp. The cub's tiny chest rose, then fell. Adam's breath hitched as he watched life return to the fragile creature. He placed it beside the lioness, who nudged it weakly with her nose. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. Another contraction racked her body. Another cub was coming. Adam moved quickly, ready this time. The second cub emerged more easily, its tiny cries filling the air. Then a third. Each new life sent waves of adrenaline through him, but he knew it wasn't over. The lioness was weak, her energy fading fast. Just as he reached for his water bottle to hydrate her, a sound froze him in place. A deep, guttural growl. He turned his head slowly, his blood running cold. Just beyond the clearing, hidden in the tall grass, a massive male lion stood watching. His golden mane bristled, muscles coiled, eyes locked onto Adam. He had been so focused on the birth that he hadn't noticed the king's arrival. The lion stepped forward, his growl rumbling through the ground like distant thunder. Adam's pulse hammered in his ears. He knew lions well enough to recognize the danger. This wasn't just any male, it was likely the father, and he saw Adam as a threat. The lioness lifted her head weakly, letting out a feeble growl, but she was too exhausted to do more. The male's amber eyes flickered between Adam and his vulnerable mate. It was a test, a challenge. Adam's mind raced. Running was not an option. Any sudden movement would trigger an attack. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, showing submission. He placed his hands on the ground, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. The lion took another step closer, sniffing the air. Then, something shocking happened. The male lion stopped. He let out a short, gruff exhale, and instead of attacking, he stepped closer to the lioness and her cubs. He sniffed them, his massive head lowering to nuzzle the tiny creatures. Adam watched, stunned, as the lion gently licked the newborns, his posture softening. It was an incredibly rare sight, a male showing tenderness to his young instead of indifference or aggression. Adam exhaled shakily, his body still frozen in place. He had witnessed a miracle. The lion had accepted his presence, recognizing that he had saved his family. Carefully, Adam began backing away. His instincts told him he had done enough. The lioness, though weak, was alive. The cubs were breathing. And the male, instead of killing him, had accepted him, if only for a moment. Just as he reached the edge of the clearing, something unexpected happened again. The lion lifted his head and let out a deep roar, not of warning, but of something else. It echoed through the jungle, a sound that sent shivers down Adam's spine. It was almost as if the lion was acknowledging him, thanking him in the only way he knew how. Adam didn't wait to test his luck further. With slow, careful steps, he melted into the jungle, his mind reeling. He had risked his life to help the lioness, and in return, he had witnessed something no one would believe. As he reached his campsite, he collapsed onto the ground, his body shaking from the adrenaline. He looked at his hands, still stained with blood and life. He had come here expecting to observe nature, but instead, he had become a part of it. And deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning of something far greater. Adam lay on the rough ground of his campsite, his body still trembling from the adrenaline. The jungle's night air wrapped around him, thick and alive with sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the distant roar of the very lion he had just faced. His mind couldn't process what had happened. He had risked everything, stepped into a moment no human had ever dared to interfere with, and yet he had not only survived, but had been acknowledged, thanked. Was it possible that a lion, a wild predator, had somehow understood his intentions? The thought made his heart race again, but this time not out of fear, but wonder. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the golden eyes of the lion piercing through the darkness, the fragile bodies of the cubs, the weak yet grateful look in the lioness's eyes. He turned over on his side, watching the embers of his dying fire flicker against the blackness. He had done something incredible, but the question loomed in his mind. What now? Would they be all right? Would the lioness survive the night? Would the male still be as tolerant if he returned? Logic told him to let nature take its course, but something deeper, something primal, told him his part in this story wasn't over. At the break of dawn, Adam was already on his feet, gathering his supplies. He hadn't intended to go back so soon, but something pulled him toward the clearing. Carefully, he made his way through the thick jungle, his senses on high alert. The morning mist clung to the trees, wrapping the forest in an eerie, dreamlike glow. Every step felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that he was treading into something far beyond human understanding. As he neared the clearing, he paused behind the foliage, his heart thundering. The scene before him was both beautiful and unsettling. The lioness was still lying in the same spot, her breathing shallow, her golden fur covered in dirt and dried blood. The cubs were nestled against her belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. But the male lion, he was gone. Adam's stomach twisted with uncertainty. Had the lion abandoned them? Had he left to hunt, or worse? Had he determined that the lioness was too weak to survive and moved on? A deep instinct kicked in, overriding his usual caution. Slowly, carefully, he stepped out from the cover of the trees. The lioness's ears twitched, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, there was fear, a flicker of primal aggression. But then something shifted. Recognition. She didn't growl this time. She didn't move, only watched him with tired, sunken eyes. Adam approached cautiously, keeping his body low, non-threatening. He pulled out a water bottle, his hand steady despite the thudding of his pulse. He poured a small amount into his palm and extended it toward her. At first, she didn't react. Then, weakly, she lapped at the water, her tongue rough against his skin. Relief flooded him. She was dehydrated, exhausted, but she was fighting. He took another risk, checking the cubs. They were small, fragile, but alive. One let out a tiny, squeaky growl, its eyes barely open. Adam smiled despite himself. Fighters, just like their mother. But their survival depended on her strength, and she was fading fast. A sudden rustle in the trees sent a shiver down his spine. He turned sharply, his fingers instinctively tightening around the small knife on his belt. But it wasn't the male lion returning. It was something worse. Hyenas. 3 of them slinked out from the underbrush, their dark eyes locked onto the vulnerable lioness and her cubs. Their bodies were lean, hungry, their laughter echoing in the quiet morning. Adam's blood ran cold. He had spent years studying these creatures, knew their tactics. They were opportunist scavengers, and now they saw an opportunity. A weak mother, defenseless cubs, and a lone human standing between them and an easy kill. The leader of the pack stepped forward, his yellow teeth bared in a sinister grin. Adam knew he couldn't take them all on. If the male lion had been here, they wouldn't have dared. But now it was just him. The hyena lunged. Adam barely had time to react, swinging his arm wildly to fend it off. The creature snarled, snapping its jaws inches from his face. He stumbled back, his heart hammering. Another hyena flanked him, creeping toward the cubs. And then, from the depths of the jungle, a sound like rolling thunder. A roar. It was unlike anything Adam had ever heard before, deeper, angrier, filled with pure, raw fury. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as the massive golden figure burst through the trees. The male lion. The hyenas scattered. The lion was a blur of power and rage, his claws tearing through one of the scavengers with brutal precision. The others yelped, retreating into the shadows. Adam stood frozen as the beast towered over him, his mane bristling, his amber eyes burning with something that sent chills down his spine. But he didn't attack Adam. Instead, the lion turned, nudging the lioness with his massive head, licking her wounds, checking on the cubs. There was an unspoken understanding, a silent communication between them. Adam exhaled, realizing something incredible. This wasn't just a random male. This was her mate. He had returned, and he had saved them all. Adam stepped back, giving them space. He knew now that his role in this was over, at least for now. Nature had taken back control. He had intervened at the right moment, but this wasn't his world. It was theirs. As he turned to leave, he felt the lion's gaze on him one last time. A lingering look, something ancient and knowing, before the beast turned his attention back to his family. Adam walked away, his heart full. He had come here expecting to be an observer, a scientist. But he had left something more, a part of something primal, something sacred. As the jungle swallowed him once more, he knew he would never be the same. Adam trekked back through the dense jungle, his mind swirling with everything that had transpired. His body still hummed with the remnants of adrenaline, but more than anything, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had done something unimaginable, stood between a lioness and death itself. He had witnessed something few humans ever would. He had been part of a world that didn't belong to him. Yet, for a brief moment, it had accepted him. But a lingering question clawed at the edges of his thoughts. Was it truly over? That night, as he sat by his campfire, staring into the flickering flames, his heart remained unsettled. He told himself he wouldn't go back, that he had already done enough. The lioness had her mate, her cubs were alive, and nature had resumed its course. But deep down, he knew the story wasn't finished. Something pulled at him, an instinct as ancient as the jungle itself. He needed to check on them, just once more. As dawn broke, he made his way back. The jungle felt different this time, more alive, more watchful. Every rustling leaf, every distant growl, felt like a warning. He moved carefully, his steps slow and deliberate. When he reached the clearing, he expected to see the lioness resting, the male standing guard, the cubs nestled safely between them. But what he saw instead made his stomach drop. The lioness was alone. She lay on her side, her breathing even weaker than before. The cubs huddled against her, their tiny bodies trembling. But the male lion, their protector, was nowhere in sight. Adam's pulse quickened. Where had he gone? Had something happened? He moved cautiously, inching closer. The lioness barely reacted this time. Her golden eyes flickered open for just a moment before closing again. She was fading fast. Adam clenched his jaw. He knew that without her, the cubs wouldn't survive. And without the male, there was no one to defend them. Then a sound, distant but unmistakable. A deep, guttural roar. But this wasn't the powerful call of a dominant male. It was different. Pained. Desperate. Adam's chest tightened. The male was in trouble. Against every rational thought, he followed the sound. The jungle grew darker, the trees thicker, the air heavier. The roars became more frantic, laced with something that sent ice through Adam's veins, fear. And then he saw him. The male lion stood trapped in a snare, his powerful body twisted in pain, his golden mane stained with dirt. His amber eyes burned with rage, but his movements were sluggish. He had been there for hours, maybe longer. Poachers. Adam's blood ran cold. He had seen the signs, traps, disturbed ground, unnatural silences in the forest, but he had hoped they were abandoned. Now, staring at the magnificent beast struggling against the cruel metal wire cutting into his flesh, he knew the truth. They were still out there. He had no time to think. If he didn't act now, the lion would die. Adam's hands trembled as he pulled out his knife. He moved closer, knowing that at any moment, the lion could lash out in fear or pain. But something in those golden eyes stopped him. They weren't wild with rage anymore. They were pleading. Adam worked quickly, sawing through the thick wire. The lion growled low, his muscles twitching, but he didn't attack. Inch by inch, Adam freed him, ignoring the sweat dripping down his face, the fear gnawing at his gut. And then, with one final snap, the snare fell away. The lion staggered, his massive body swaying. He could barely stand. Adam took a step back, ready for the worst. But the lion didn't attack. He didn't growl. Instead, he looked at Adam for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them, before turning and limping back toward the clearing. Adam followed at a distance, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he had just done. Had he saved the lion? Or had he doomed himself? When they reached the clearing, the lioness lifted her head weakly. The cubs squeaked, sensing their father's return. The male, despite his wounds, moved toward her, pressing his massive head against hers. A soft rumble passed between them. Relief. Reunion. Adam exhaled, his chest tight with something indescribable. He had done it. He had given them a chance. But the danger wasn't over. A sharp crack echoed through the trees. A sound Adam knew all too well. A gunshot. His body froze. The lion's ears perked. The jungle held its breath. And then voices. Rough, low voices, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The poachers were coming. Panic surged through Adam. He had to move, had to get out of there before they found him. But then he looked at the lions. The lioness too weak to move, the male still injured, the cubs too small to flee. They wouldn't stand a chance. His fists clenched. He had already risked his life once for them. Could he do it again? The voices grew closer. Adam's mind raced. He couldn't fight them. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself or the lions. But he had one advantage. They didn't know he was here. Quickly, he gathered dry leaves and twigs, stacking them together. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small container of lighter fluid. He had planned to use it for his campfire, but now it had a different purpose. With shaking hands, he lit a match. Flames erupted, devouring the dry brush. Smoke curled into the air, thick and blinding. The jungle erupted in chaos. Birds screeched, animals scattered. The voices of the poachers turned frantic. Adam didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and ran, his heart hammering. He didn't stop until he reached his campsite, his lungs burning, his mind reeling. He had done it. The fire would drive them away, at least for now. The lions had a chance. As he collapsed onto the ground, exhaustion finally overtaking him, he realized something. This wasn't just their fight anymore. It was his, too. And he wasn't done yet. Adam sat in the darkness, his breath ragged, his body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. The jungle around him was alive with the distant crackling of flames and the scattered cries of animals fleeing the disturbance he had created. He had done what he could for now, but he knew the poachers wouldn't just vanish. They would return. They always did. And this time, they'd be more determined, more ruthless. His actions had likely angered them, made them desperate. A wildfire in the middle of the jungle wasn't enough to scare away men like them for good. It only made them more dangerous. The lions were safe for the moment, but how long would that last? He thought of a lioness, weak and barely clinging to life, of the cubs, so small and vulnerable, and of the male, who, despite his strength, had already been wounded by the cruelty of humans. They weren't just animals anymore. They were something more, something he had become responsible for. And that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Sleep refused to come that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent his nerves into overdrive. He imagined shadows moving in the darkness, imagined cold, unfeeling eyes watching from the trees. The jungle, once a place of beauty and wonder, now felt like a battlefield. And he was right in the middle of it. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy, Adam had made his decision. He couldn't just walk away. He wouldn't. Not now. He packed what little he had left, his knife, his canteen, a few protein bars, and made his way back through the jungle, following the now familiar path toward the clearing. Every step was calculated, slow, careful. He couldn't afford to make noise. The poachers could still be lurking, waiting. When he reached the clearing, his heart clenched. The lioness was still there, but she looked even weaker than before. Her breathing was shallow, her golden coat dull and lifeless. The cubs nuzzled against her, seeking warmth, protection, life. But what caught his attention most was the male. He was gone. Adam's stomach twisted. Had the poachers come in the night? Had they taken him? Had he wandered off, wounded and delirious? The possibilities flooded his mind, each one worse than the last. But there was no time to dwell on it. The lioness wouldn't last much longer without food, without water. And the cubs, if she died, they wouldn't survive. Not alone. He knelt beside her, hesitating only for a moment before reaching into his pack. Carefully, he poured some water into his cupped hand and lifted it to her muzzle. At first, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, weakly, her tongue flicked out, lapping at the liquid. It wasn't much, but it was something. He knew he needed more. And food. But how? Hunting wasn't an option. He had no weapons, no tools. But there had to be another way. He glanced toward the trees. The jungle provided for its own. He just had to find what they needed. For the next hour he worked tirelessly, gathering whatever he could, fresh water from a nearby stream, a few fallen fruits he knew to be safe, even digging up some edible roots. It wasn't much, but it was something. When he returned, he found the lioness watching him. Weak as she was, her eyes still held something fierce, something ancient. A silent question. Why are you helping me? He had no answer. Or maybe he did. Maybe it was because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't just an observer of nature. He was part of it. She accepted the food, albeit reluctantly. The cubs, however, were less cautious. They sniffed at the fruit, pawed at the roots. their tiny bodies still filled with the curiosity and innocence of youth. It gave him hope, but the male's absence still gnawed at him. He had to find him. The search took him deeper into the jungle, past the familiar paths, past the safety of what he knew. Every step was a gamble, but he had no choice. Then he found the blood, dark smears against the earth, leading toward a dense thicket. His pulse quickened. He followed the trail, heart pounding. The jungle closed in around him, thick and suffocating. Then, through the tangled undergrowth, he saw him. The lion lay sprawled on his side, his body rising and falling in slow, ragged breaths. His wound had reopened. Blood matted his golden fur. He was alive, but just barely. Adam didn't think. He moved, fast and without hesitation. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. The lion let out a low growl, but there was no strength behind it. He had to get him back to the clearing. But how? Panic threatened to take hold, but he forced it down. Think. Then a sound. Distant, but growing closer. Voices. The poachers. Adam's mind raced. They were searching for him. For the lion. He couldn't let them find either. He needed a distraction. Glancing around, he spotted a fallen branch, thick and heavy. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Carefully, he broke off a few smaller twigs, wrapping them in a piece of cloth from his shirt. He struck his knife against a stone, creating sparks. Fire. The dry leaves caught instantly, smoke rising into the air. He didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned back to the lion, gripping the beast's massive paw. "Come on," he whispered. "We're getting out of here." The lion stirred, eyes half-lidded, but he didn't resist as Adam pulled. Inch by inch, he dragged him away from the clearing, away from the voices, away from danger. The jungle burned behind them. By the time they reached the clearing, Adam was covered in sweat, his muscles screaming in protest. But he had done it. The lioness lifted her head as they approached. A weak but familiar rumble escaped her throat. The male stirred, his eyes meeting hers. They were together again. But Adam knew it wasn't over. The poachers would come. The jungle wasn't safe anymore. And he had a choice to make. Walk away or fight.